Nearly all people in Somalia are Sunni Muslims. For more than 1,400 years, Islam made a great part of Somali society. Practicing Islam reinforces distinctions that further set Somalis apart from their immediate neighbors, many of whom are either Christians or adherents of indigenous faiths. The early Muslims sought refuge from persecution in cities on the northern Somali coast. For generations, Islam in Somalia followed the Ash'ari theology, Shafi'i jurisprudence, and Sufism, until recent decades when Salafism has made inroads. Influence of Islamic religious leaders has varied by region, being greater in the north than among some groups in the settled regions of the south. Among nomads, the exigencies of pastoral life gave greater weight to the warrior's role, and religious leaders were expected to remain aloof from political matters. The role of religious functionaries began to shrink in the 1950s and 1960s as some of the legal and educational powers and responsibilities were transferred to secular authorities. The position of religious leaders changed substantially after the 1969 revolution and the introduction of scientific socialism. Siad Barre insisted that his version of socialism was compatible with Quranic principles, and he condemned atheism. Religious leaders, however, were warned not to meddle in politics. The new government instituted legal changes that some religious figures saw as contrary to Islamic precepts. The regime reacted sharply to criticism, executing some of the protesters. Subsequently, religious leaders seemed to accommodate themselves to the government. History. Birth of Islam and Middle Ages. Islam was introduced to the northern Somali coast early on from the Arabian Peninsula, shortly after the Hijra. Zila's 2 Mihrab Masjid al-Qiblatain dates to the 7th century, and is the oldest mosque in the city. In the late 9th century, al-Yaqubi wrote that Muslims were living along the northern Somali seaboard. He also mentioned that the Adil Kingdom had its capital in the city, suggesting that the Adil Sultanate with Zila as its headquarters dates back to at least the 9th or 10th century. According to I.M. Lewis, the polity was governed by local dynasties, who also ruled over the similarly established Sultanate of Mogadishu in the littoral Benadir region to the south. Adil's history from this founding period forth would be characterized by a succession of battles with neighboring Abyssinia. In 1332, the Zila-based king of Adil was slain in a military campaign aimed at halting the Abyssinian Emperor Amdacian I's march toward the city. When the last Sultan of Ifat Saad ad-Din II was also killed by Emperor Dawit I in Zila in 1410, his children escaped to Yemen, before later returning in 1415. In the early 15th century, Adil's capital was moved further inland to the town of Dhaka, where Sabr ad-Din II, the eldest son of Saad ad-Din II, established a new base after his return from Yemen. Adil's headquarters were again relocated the following century, this time to Hara. For this new capital, Adil organized an effective army led by Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi that invaded the Abyssinian Empire. This 16th-century campaign is historically known as the Conquest of Abyssinia. During the war, Imam Ahmad pioneered the use of cannons supplied by the Ottoman Empire, which he imported through Zila and deployed against Abyssinian forces and the Portuguese allies led by Cristóvão da Gama. Some scholars argue that this conflict proved, through the use on both sides, the value of firearms like the matchlock musket. cannons and the arquebus over traditional weapons. During the age of the Ajuran, the sultanates and republics of Merka, Mogadishu, Barawa, Hobyo and the respective ports flourished and had a lucrative foreign commerce, with ships sailing to and coming from Arabia, India, Venetia, Persia, Egypt, Portugal and as far away as China. The Vasco da Gama, who passed by Mogadishu in the 15th century, noted that it was a large city with houses several stories high and large palaces in its center, in addition to many mosques with cylindrical minarets. The city of Mogadishu came to be known as the City of Islam, and controlled the East African gold trade for several centuries. In the 16th century, Duarte Barbosa noted that many ships from the kingdom of Kambaya in modern-day India sailed to Mogadishu with cloth and spices, for which they in return received gold, wax and ivory. Barbosa also highlighted the abundance of meat, wheat, barley, horses, and fruit on the coastal markets, which generated enormous wealth for the merchants. Mogadishu was also the center of a thriving textile industry known as Tob Benadia, specialized for the markets in Egypt, among other places. Modern era because Muslims believe that the faith was revealed in its complete form to Muhammad. It has been difficult to adapt Islam to the social, economic, and political changes that began with the expansion of colonial rule in the late 19th century. Some modifications have occurred, however. One response was to stress a return to Orthodox Muslim traditions and to oppose Westernization totally. The Sufi Brotherhoods were at the forefront of this movement, personified in Somalia by Muhammad Abdullah Hassan in the early 20th century. Generally, the leaders of Islamic orders opposed the spread of Western education. Another response was to reform Islam by reinterpreting it. For this perspective, early Islam was seen as a protest against abuse, corruption, and inequality. Reformers therefore attempted to prove that Muslim scriptures contained all elements needed to deal with modernization. To this school of thought belongs Islamic Socialism, identified particularly with Egyptian nationalist Gamal Abdel Nasser. His ideas appealed to a number of Somalis, especially those who had studied in Cairo in the 1950s and 1960s. The 1961 constitution guaranteed freedom of religion but also declared the newly independent Republic an Islamic state. The first two post-independence governments paid lip service to the principles of Islamic socialism but made relatively few changes. The coup of October 21, 1969, installed a radical regime committed to profound change. Shortly afterward, Stella.Oba, the official newspaper of the Supreme Revolutionary Council, published an editorial about relations between Islam and socialism and the differences between scientific and Islamic socialism. Islamic socialism was said to have become a servant of capitalism and neocolonialism and a tool manipulated by a privileged, rich, and powerful class. In contrast, scientific socialism was based on the altruistic values that inspired genuine Islam. Religious leaders should therefore leave secular affairs to the new leaders, who were striving for goals that conformed with Islamic principles. Soon after, the government arrested several protesting religious leaders and accused them of counter-revolutionary propaganda and of conniving with reactionary elements in the Arabian Peninsula. The authorities also dismissed several members of religious tribunals for corruption and incompetence. When the three-year plan, 1971 to 1973, was launched in January 1971, SRC leaders felt compelled to win the support of religious leaders so as to transform the existing social structure. On September 4, 1971, Siad Barre exhorted more than 100 religious teachers to participate in building a new socialist society. He criticized the method of teaching in Quranic schools and charged some with using religion for personal profit. The campaign for scientific socialism intensified in 1972. On the occasion of Eid al-Adha, the major Muslim festival associated with the pilgrimage, the president defined scientific socialism as half practical work and half ideological belief. He declared that work and belief were compatible with Islam because the Quran condemned exploitation and moneylending and urged compassion, unity, and cooperation among Muslims. But he stressed the distinction between religion as an ideological instrument for the manipulation of power and as a moral force. He condemned the anti-religious attitude of Marxists. Religion, Siad Barre said, was an integral part of the Somali worldview, but it belonged in the private sphere, whereas scientific socialism dealt with material concerns such as poverty. Religious leaders should exercise their moral influence but refrain from interfering in political or economic matters. In early January 1975, evoking the message of equality, justice, and social progress contained in the Quran, Siad Barre announced a new family law that gave women the right to inheritance on an equal basis with men. Some Somalis believe the law was proof that the SRC wanted to undermine the basic structure of Islamic society. In Mogadishu, 23 religious leaders protested inside the mosques. They were arrested and charged with acting at the instigation of a foreign power and with violating state security. 10 were executed. Sheikh Ahmed, Sheikh Mohammed Walala and Sheikh Hassan Abdullah were among them. Most religious leaders, however, kept silent. The government continued to organize training courses for sheikhs in scientific socialism, Sunni Sufi orders and Islamic scholars. Religious orders always have played a significant role in Somali Islam. The rise of these orders was connected with the development of Sufism, a mystical sect within Islam that began during the 9th and 10th centuries and reached its height during the 12th and 13th. In Somalia, Sufi orders appeared in towns during the 15th century and rapidly became a revitalizing force. Followers of Sufism seek a closer personal relationship to God through special spiritual disciplines. Escape from self is facilitated by poverty, seclusion, and other forms of self-denial. Members of Sufi orders are commonly called dervishes, for the Persian dara or ish. Leaders of branches or congregations of these orders are given the Arabic title sheikh, a term usually reserved for those learned in Islam and rarely applied to ordinary wadads. Dervishes wandered from place to place teaching. They are best known for the ceremonies, called dhikr, in which states of visionary ecstasy are induced by group chanting of religious texts and by rhythmic gestures, dancing, and deep breathing. The object is to free oneself from the body and to be lifted into the presence of God. Dervishes have been important as founders of agricultural religious communities called Jamaat. A few of these were home to celibate men only, but usually the Jamaat were inhabited by families. Most Somalis were nominal members of Sufi orders, but few underwent the rigors of devotion to the religious life, even for a short time. 3 Sufi orders were prominent in Somalia. In order of their introduction into the country, they were the Qadiriyya, the Adriyya, and the Salafiyya. The Rifa'iyya, an offshoot of the Qadiriyya, was represented mainly among Arabs resident in Mogadishu. The Qadiriyya, the oldest Sufi order, was founded in Baghdad by Abdul Qadir al-Jilani in 1166 and introduced to the Somali Adal in the 15th 16th century. During the 18th century, it was spread among the Oromo and the Afar of Ethiopia, often under the leadership of Somali sheikhs. Its earliest known advocate in northern Somalia was Sheikh Abdurrahman Arizona Zilawi, who died in 1883. At the time, Qadiriya adherents were merchants in the ports and elsewhere. In a separate development, the Qadiriya order also spread into the southern Somali port cities of Baraur and Mogadishu at an uncertain date. In 1819, Sheikh Ibrahim Hassan Jabro acquired land on the Juba River and established a religious center in the form of a farming community, the first Somali Jama. Outstanding figures of the Qadiriya in Somalia included Sheikh Mohammed Barawi, who spread the teaching of the Sufi order in the southern interior. He wrote much devotional poetry in Arabic and attempted to translate traditional hymns from Arabic into Somali, working out his own phonetic system. Another was Sheikh Abdurrahman Abdullah of Mogadishu, who stressed deep mysticism. Because of his reputation for sanctity, his tomb at Mogadishu became a pilgrimage center for the Shabelle Valley, and his writings continued to be circulated by his followers as late as the early 1990s. The Idriya order was founded by Ahmad ibn Idris of Mecca. It was brought to Somalia by Sheikh Ali Madur Ogba of Mecca in Somalia, a distinguished poet who joined the order during a pilgrimage to Mecca. His supposed visions and miracles attributed to him gained him a reputation for sanctity, and his tomb became a popular destination for pilgrims. The Idriya, the smallest of the three Sufi orders, has few ritual requirements beyond some simple prayers and hymns. During its ceremonies, however, participants often go into trances. A conflict over the leadership of the Idriya among its Arab founders led to the establishment of the Salafism in 1887 by Mohammed ibn Saleh. The order spread first among the Somalis of the Ogaden area of Ethiopia, who entered Somalia about 1880. The Salafism's most active proselytizer was Sheikh Muhammad Guled al-Rashidi, who became a regional leader. He settled among the Shidal people, where he obtained land and established a Jama'. Later he founded another Jama' among the Adherents and then returned to establish still another community among the Shidal before his death in 1918. Perhaps the best-known Somali Salafi figure was Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, leader of a lengthy resistance to the British until 1920. Generally, the Salafi and the Idriya leaders were more interested in the establishment of a Jama' along the Shabelle and Juba rivers and the fertile land between them than in teaching, because few were learned in Islam. Their early efforts to establish farming communities resulted in cooperative cultivation and harvesting and some effective agricultural methods. In Somalia's riverine region, for example, only Jama' members thought of stripping the brush from areas around the fields to reduce the breeding places of tsetse-flies. Local leaders of brotherhoods customarily asked lineage heads in the areas where they wished to settle for permission to build the mosques and communities. A piece of land was usually freely given. Often it was an area between two clans or one in which nomads had access to a river. The presence of a Jama' not only provided a buffer zone between two hostile groups, but also caused the giver to acquire a blessing, since the land was considered given to God. Tenure was a matter of charity only, however, and sometimes became precarious in case of disagreements. No statistics were available in 1990 on the number of such settlements, but in the 1950s there were more than 90 in the south, with a total of about 35,000 members. Most were in the Bakul, Gedo, and Bay regions or along the middle and lower Shabla River. There were few Jamaat in other regions because the climate and soil did not encourage agricultural settlements. Membership in a brotherhood is theoretically a voluntary matter unrelated to kinship. However, lineages are often affiliated with the specific brotherhood, and a man usually joins his father's order. Initiation is followed by a ceremony during which the order's dhiki is celebrated. Novices swear to accept the branch head as the spiritual guide. Each order has its own hierarchy that is supposedly a substitute for the kin group from which the members have separated themselves. Veneration is given to previous heads of the order, known as the chain of blessing, rather than to ancestors. This practice is especially followed in the South, where place of residence tends to have more significance than lineage. Leaders of Sufi orders and the branches and of specific congregations are said to have baraka, a state of blessedness implying an inner spiritual power that is inherent in the religious office, and may cling to the tomb of a revered leader, who, upon death, is considered a saint. However, some saints are venerated by Sufis because of the religious reputations, whether or not they were associated with an order or one of its communities. Sainthood also has been ascribed to other Sufis because of the status as founders of clans or large lineages. Northern pastoral nomads are likely to honor lineage founders as saints. Sedentary Somalis revere saints for their piety and baraka. Because of the saint's spiritual presence at his tomb, Sufi pilgrims journey there to seek aid. Members of the saint's order also visit the tomb, particularly on the anniversaries of his birth and death. The traditional learning of a wadad includes a form of folk astronomy based on stellar movements and related to seasonal changes. Its primary objective is to signal the times for migration, but it may also be used to set the dates of rituals that are specifically Somali. This folk knowledge is also used in ritual methods of healing and averting misfortune, as well as for divination. Wadado help avert misfortune by making protective amulets and charms that transmit some of the barakat to others, or by adding the Quran's barakat to the amulet through a written passage. The baraka of a saint may be obtained in the form of an object that has touched or been placed near his tomb. Although Wadado may use the power to curse as a sanction, misfortune generally is not attributed to curses or witchcraft. Somalis have accepted the orthodox Muslim view that a man's conduct will be judged in an afterlife. However, a person who commits an antisocial act, such as patricide, is thought possessed of supernatural evil powers. Like other Muslims, Somalis believe in jinn. Certain kinds of illness, including tuberculosis and pneumonia, or symptoms such as sneezing, coughing, vomiting, and loss of consciousness, are believed by some Somalis to result from spirit possession, namely, the ifrit of the spirit world. The condition is treated by a sheikh who reads portions of the Quran over the patient repeatedly. Yibir clan members are popularly held to be descendants of Jewish Hebrew forebears. The etymology of the word Yibir is also believed by some to have come from the word for Hebrew. However, spokespersons for the Yibir have generally not tried to make the presence known to Jewish Israeli authorities. Despite the putative Jewish origins, the overwhelming majority of the Yibir, like the Somali population in general, adhere to Islam and know practically nothing of Judaism. Salafism. Following the outbreak of the civil war in the early 1990s, Islamism appeared to be largely confined to the radical al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya group. In 1992, Colonel Abdullah Yusuf Ahmed marshaled forces to successfully expel an Islamist extremist group linked to the Outfen, which had laid siege to Bosasa, a prominent port city and the commercial capital of the northeastern part of the country. The turn of the 21st century saw an increasing prevalence of puritanical Sunnism, including in the form of Muwahidism and Salafism.